On the screen you'll see some terms that are important for you to be able to define in order for you to understand the rest of the information that we'll be talking about. Verbal abuse is any kind of name-calling, foul language. It is always aimed at a person, and it's meant to undermine that person's confidence. Emotional abuse is the willful use of words or actions that attempt to undermine the person's self-esteem. Rape is forcible, degrading, and non-consensual sexual intercourse, which can include violence and or intimidation. Rape is always about power and displaced anger, feelings of incompetence, satisfaction of a sadistic need. Sexual abuse is sexual contact or sexual activity that is not wanted by the receiver. It's generally inflicted on someone that the abuser considers less powerful, less physically powerful, or emotionally powerful. Abuser is always someone usually close to the victim. It may be a significant figure in the victim's life. Maybe an acquaintance, a family member, a family friend. Sexual harassment is the physical or verbal sexual innuendos that typically occur at work, job settings, and it's usually from someone of an authoritative position. Incest is the sexual intercourse between persons that are so closely related that they are forbidden to marry by law. As the United States population grows, we are going to see more and more people becoming vulnerable because they are dependent on others to meet their most basic needs. The study conducted in June 2010 by the CDC found that there were 5,961,568 cases of elder abuse that was reported that year. We anticipate that that is lowballing. There are quite a few more that go unreported every year. But at that number, it is still 9.5% of the elderly population. The average age of the victim is 78. National Elder Abuse Incidence Studies found that more than 500,000 Americans aged 60 and up were the victims of abuse. This kind of abuse can include slapping, hitting, striking with an object, any type of assault that results in bruising, sprains, abrasions, skeletal fractures, and or burns. This type of abuse takes place in private homes, also in established facilities. It's estimated that 30% of our elderly population is actually abused by their own children. Respite care, you see on the slide, respite care is a service that is offered to the care provider to provide relief. It is a service that will stay with the elderly person so that the primary caregiver is able to take personal time away. In some cases, this respite care can last for up to sometimes 2 weeks. Neglect also occurs. Now, neglect is improper nutrition or improper use of the victim's finances. It's any situation that is deemed not in the best interest for the older person. There's also an estimate of 10% of our older population greater than 65 are going to be victims of some type of abuse or neglect. The typical characteristics of an abuser say that they're under some type of economical stress, substance abuse, maybe they're a previous victim of family abuse. Children who grow up with an abusive parent, when that caregiver role switches and the child is the caregiver, it is likely that the abuse they endured will be inflicted upon that elderly parent. Also, characteristics of the abusers are that they're oftentimes just exhausted and frustrated with the caregiver role. The individual that is in need of care, the elderly person's needs, sometimes will outweigh the abilities of the caregiver to provide for them, and they become very frustrated and very exhausted with the needs. and can take it out in a neglectful or physical form. Now, the typical characteristics of the victim are normally white, female, over the age of 70, mentally or physically impaired in some way to some degree, usually rendering them dependent, and as I said, their needs will usually exceed the caregiver's ability to care for them. That puts them at a much greater risk for enduring abuse or neglect. Adult Protective Services cases that did involve elderly abuse were 68%. Out of that 68%, the elderly abuse was perpetrated by an adult child or spouse 66% of the time. Murder victims over the age of 60 who were killed by their own children was 42%. Murder victims over the age of 60 who were killed by their spouse, 24%. Those are some really staggering statistics. The alarming reality is that rape also happens to your elderly population as well as to children and adults. It also occurs in private home settings, healthcare facilities, both long-term and assisted living facilities. One study examined 28 Massachusetts cases in which sexual abuse was identified by the elder abuse caseworker. In all 28 cases, the victim did reside in the community, not in a nursing home, not in an institutional facility. All 28 were female, and their age range was from 65 to 101 years of age. And while all of the offenders were male except one, 4 out of 5 of the offenders were caregivers to the victim, the vast majority of whom had significant impairments, either physically or mentally, which again made them totally dependent on the caregiver for their daily assistance and, basic needs. The offenders were usually relatives of the victim trying to care for them, and in 39% of the cases it was the adult son who was the abuser. In 29% of the cases, it was the victim's own husband. Over 1/3 were elderly themselves, and they were the victim's spouse, male friend, or brother. That's the victim. Perpetrator. Over 1/3 of the perpetrators were also elderly, and being the victim's spouse, male friend, or brother. The most frequent form of abuse suffered by the victims in this study was repeated vaginal rape. It is essential that any healthcare provider working with elder abuse victims has to be able to recognize that this is an older person, and if that person is competent, then they do have the right to refuse any and all interventions, even those that are for their own good. Children do not always have the words that they need to express themselves, certainly in relation to what is going on or what is happening to them when it is abuse. They may be too fearful of the perpetrator to say anything, or maybe the person that they're trying to tell does not understand what they're saying. Oftentimes children will act out their abuse in their own play behaviors. Your mental health book talks about physical, emotional, and sexual abuse specific to the child. We're going to be discussing this a little bit over the next few slides as well. The child is normally going to be terrified to report the abuse, since statistically the abuser is more often someone that they know than a stranger, more often a relative, parent, sibling, friend of the family. The child's very confused. They don't have the coping mechanisms or experience to understand what's going on or why it's happening to them. So they get very confused. The perpetrator is larger than they are and very intimidating to the child. Sometimes they are threatened with abuse of someone else that they love if they tell. Annually in the United States, there are 3 million confirmed reports of child abuse. These are signs and symptoms that child sexual abuse and or neglect is taking place. Some of them are more difficult to recognize, and some of them are very red flag telltale signs. A child with difficulty walking or sitting should always be evaluated. A child having nightmares and bedwetting later on in age, when this is not a normal process for them, should be evaluated. Changes in appetite, sophisticated and unusual sexual knowledge or terminology should be a red flag. Frequently absent from school, begs or steals food or money. This could indicate neglect. Lacks needed medical or dental care, immunizations, or glasses. This should be approached carefully and reported. If the child is consistently dirty and has severe body odor, that can be considered neglect. You need to actually dig a little deeper, meet with the parents, find out if there are needs that the parents would like to be able to meet but are unable to. Maybe they don't have running water, maybe they don't have jobs or power. In any case, this is neglect as well. Lacks sufficient clothing, abuses alcohol or other drugs at a very early age. Sometimes the abusers will give the child alcohol or drugs to make the child less fearful or more manageable during acts of sexual abuse. Pregnancy and STD, certainly a red flag. Refusal to change in front of others, certainly in a high school setting, in locker rooms, PE, children are changing in front of each other without, any difficulty doing so. But when there is one that refuses to change in front of others and becomes extremely anxious and upset at the thought of it, there's probably a reason behind that, and it needs to be investigated a little further. And the last one, if a child reports they've been abused, that has to be taken very seriously. 90% of your rape victims under the age of 12 verbalized that they knew their offender, and only 24% of sexually abused children disclose that they are being sexually abused immediately. On average, a child endures up to 6 months or even a year of sexual abuse before they disclose that it's going on. And 7% of sexually abused children will endure the abuse for more than 5 years before they report it to anyone. No one really understands why child abuse occurs. A lot of times not even the abuser understands why. A number of issues have been researched and have been factored into trying to understand and help to prevent future abuse. But more often than not, the abuser was severely abused as a child themselves by their own parents or relative. An overwhelming life crisis after another, such as unemployment, finances, living environment, poverty. Sometimes this will stem these behaviors that the abuser is unable to control. They don't have any support system usually. They have no contact with other adults. They're self-isolating, socially isolated, very poor impulse control, poor temper control, lacking in coping skills or strategies. It's likely that they have an alcohol or drug dependency, a lot of paranoid, suspicious, and guarded behaviors, difficulty trusting other adults. 90% of your children live in stressful life situations. They also will have poor adaptive coping skills once this abuse occurs or begins. Expecting the child to be perfect, comparing the child to a model child behavior, this is an unrealistic expectation of a parent or an adult-child relationship. A lot of times the abuser will be overly protective of the child that they are abusing. They will actually act jealous and controlling over the child if the child begins to have other friends or to spend time away from home with other companions. They'll buy the child lavish gifts or jewelry. They will severely limit the interactions of the child with other children their age, even be jealous and controlling with other family members' attention to the child. Physical abuse results in injury. Emotional abuse results in lifelong impairments in all areas of functioning. Both are very difficult for the child to recover from. Children are vulnerable and they feel powerless. Maltreatment hurts deeply and it has long-lasting effects, even into adulthood. The child may act out in very irrational behaviors, frustrated, angry. Anything is considered abuse, whether or not the caregiver intended to harm the child, if injury is the result from over-disciplining or from physical punishment. This can include punching, kicking, beating, biting, burning, shaking the child, throwing the child, and stabs. Indicators of neglect are listed in your book for you. Remember that rape is an act of aggression, not passion. It is identified by the use of force and executed against the person's will. Acquaintance and date rape are essentially the same. If the rape occurs as a social encounter that the victim agreed to, it is a date rape. Otherwise, it's an acquaintance rape. It can be the first date, or it can be a relationship that has been ongoing for several months, where sexual intercourse has not occurred, or it may be that they merely know the victimizer. College campuses are the leader in the environment for acquaintance and date rape. Marital rape has only recently been recognized, as in the case where a spouse may be held liable for sexual abuse directed at a marital partner against that marital partner's will. In 1993, this became a crime in all 50 states. Statutory rape is the unlawful intercourse between a person who is over the age of consent and a person who is under the age of consent. The age of consent is going to vary from state to state. It ranges from 14 to 18. The victimizer can be arrested even if the victim consented but is below the age of consent. The profile of a victimizer. The mother of the rapist has been described as seductive but rejecting toward her child, overbearing, seductive undertones, quick to withdraw her love and affection or attention whenever her male child would go against her wishes, dominating over the male child, beginning in childhood and usually continuing well into his adult life. That is an older hypothesis. In this situation, it was uncommon that the mother and her male child would share everything with no secrets, and that when the son's delinquent behavior got him into trouble, the mother would rescue him. Showed no love or attention whenever he would go against her will, though. Very domineering, very possessive as a mother in the child's upbringing. As I said, well into his adulthood. It is said that the anxiety and the anger that develops and is being felt by the son becomes displaced, and he takes it out on other women. Many rapists grow up in an abusive home themselves. Even when the father is the abuser, and the anger may be directed onto the mother, even then by the son, because he feels like she did nothing to protect him as a child. And if the anger is directed at his mother, it is taken out on strangers. Most often, this is when the rape occurs, violent rapes. The greatest number of rapists are between the age of 25 and 44. 51% of our male rapists are white. 47% of our male rapists are African American. Many with relationships, many are married and have children. And most of your rapists do not have a mental illness. When the attack is a stranger rape, victims are not chosen for any reason, nothing that they did or nothing about their appearance. They are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There are three major categories of rape. The three major categories of rape are blitz sexual assault, contact sexual assault, and home invasion sexual assault. A blitz sexual assault is when the perpetrator rapidly and brutally assaults the victim with no prior contact with the victim. Blitz assaults usually occur at night in public areas. Contact sexual assault is when the suspect makes contact unknowingly with the victim, then tries to gain his or her trust and confidence before assaulting him or her. Contact perpetrators pick their victims in bars or areas that have a social element to them, try to build up that trust and confidence, luring them into other more secluded areas, or otherwise trying to coerce the victim into a situation that will lead to a sexual assault. The last one was home invasion sexual assault, and this is when a stranger breaks into a victim's home to commit a sexual assault or rape. This concludes Module G. Thank you very much.